Hey, everybody. This interview was recorded in June, and just getting all excited, I plugged the June charity during the recording. But then I learned that the book that we're talking about, the wonderful, very informational book Slip about eating disorders that you're going to hear about today, doesn't come out until early August. And so it's August, y'all. And we're going to go with the August charity. Just wanted to let you know what that is. Feel free to also endorse Covenant House, California, which is the June one that I mentioned there. But in the month of August, our nonprofit of focus is Improving Lives Knots. Improving Lives is the organization. Improving Lives Knots, Notts, that is, .org.uk is where you'll find out more about this wonderful nonprofit that aims to reduce social isolation, improve physical and mental health, and increase independence and financial security for those with long-term mental health conditions in Nottinghamshire, England in particular. Josh Woods, who is their business manager, has been on the program several times. If you go back in the archives of the Broken Brain and look at those episodes, are wonderful episodes about public health and the things that they are doing to provide support for those with mental health issues in their community. So I plugged them and talked with them quite a bit over the years and wanted to come back around this month to highlight the good work that they are doing. So go to improvinglivesknots.org.uk in order to learn more and to support and share information about this wonderful organization.
The Broken Brain.
Recording in progress.
Hey everybody, it's me, Dwight. I'm back with you again for another episode of The Broken Brain. Really, really grateful to have everyone out there participating, listening, and we are talking about a subject today. We always try to talk about important subjects, but this is one that I like to revisit every now and then because it is, and I'm going to get my guest to comment on the research, but it has always been, as far as I have seen, one of the things classified under psychological or mental health conditions that is one of the most physically dangerous as far as the amount of deaths that it can cause and even just the quality of life damages. And we're going to really get into that. We're talking about eating disorders today. And I do want to say, because of some of the dynamics of that, just want to make sure anybody out there, as we do talk about it, this is going to be a great, very, very helpful stuff. But also just be aware if you have some of this in your recent history or triggering, just please be aware of that as you proceed and be somewhere where you can, control that for yourself and your own health. But once again, very, very helpful stuff that we're talking about. I'm joined today by Mallary Tenor Tarpley, and it's Tenore, actually. I said it wrong after all that. My word.
No worries.
Mallary is the author of the new book, Slip, Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery, a wonderful tale of some of your experiences and also others as well that I would definitely, after reading it, definitely recommend to people about this particular subject. So Mallary, thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, tell people a little bit about what led you to get into this study, expertise, and to tell your story and other stories in this book.
Sure. So I have lived experience with anorexia nervosa, which I developed when I was 12 after my mother passed away from metastatic breast cancer, and was in treatment for many years, and then was in a period of full recovery, or what I consider to be full recovery, and then struggled with a relapse in college and felt like I was living somewhat of an inauthentic life, in the sense that I was telling everyone that I was fully recovered from my eating disorder, and yet I was still very much grappling with it and felt like I couldn't really share that truth and that lived experience. And so when I set out to write this book, I really wanted to be as brutally honest as I could be. And I had written different iterations of this book beginning when I was a teenager, because I've always been a writer, always knew that I wanted to write a book, but was really writing those earlier iterations from the perspective of someone who was fully recovered. And I really yearned for a book that explored more of the messiness of the recovery process and more of the nuance behind it. But every book that I read, although many of them were quite helpful, they were either written by clinicians or by people who were fully recovered. And so I didn't see my own lived reality in those books. And that lack of a mirrored image left me feeling really misunderstood. So with this book, I really was intent on helping people to feel seen and heard. And I really wanted to explore what I call the middle place, which is this name I've given to this liminal space between acute sickness and full recovery. And so the book really tries to explore what it looks like to live with the imprints of your disorder, and what does it mean to move through the world knowing that your disorder remains a vulnerability. So the book really blends my own lived experience with the narratives of hundreds of other people who also find themselves in this space.
I really like how you even start out the book by introducing the concept that that's not binary, right? It's not, oh, you're better or you're sick. Those are the two, categories for this experience. I'm always a fan of nuance. People know that, because I think nuance has a tight relationship with reality and truth, because that's just the way that life works. And I was curious some of your thoughts about that. Obviously can have an impact on public perception and the way that loved ones relate to those going through this. I was curious, do you see that bleeding into treatment as well? Treatment approaches?
I do. I mean, I think that we've come a long way when it comes to eating disorder treatment. When I was in treatment in the late 90s and early 2000s, I don't recall anyone ever talking with me about the possibility of slips or relapses. And so that kind of just added fuel to the fire in terms of me developing this very perfectionistic idea of what recovery looked like and how it was supposed to play out. And so, as I talk about in Slip, the book, there are a lot more treatment centers now that do try to prepare patients for the reality of slips and lapses and relapses. And some of them even have relapse prevention programs. I think we still have a ways to go in terms of really having honest conversations about the fact that for some people, recovery is ongoing, and some people may end up living with the imprints of their disorder for many, many years. And by that, I mean that people like me may be better than they once were, but not all better. And so I think it's important to recognize that. And even still today in the field of eating disorders, then there can be some stigma and shame around this phrase, I'm in recovery, because the field so often pushes for full recovery. And so many of the narratives that you hear in inspirational talks or in books are from people who say that they're fully recovered with a capital F and a capital R. And I think there are other fields like addiction, for instance, where they've done a better job of adopting more nuanced verbiage. And that phrase of being in recovery is much more common, for instance, in substance abuse circles. But in the eating disorder community, it still is stigmatized to the point where the field even has these two phrases, which are quasi-recovery and pseudo-recovery. And those essentially are terms that are used to describe people who are not really all better and who are still, supposedly in recovery, but grappling with a lot of issues. And I think that those terms can be really harmful. And I always try to let people know that when I talk about the middle place, it's not about quasi or pseudo recovery. It's not about suggesting that anyone's recovery is fake or somehow not real. But it's more so about really speaking truth to the challenges of recovery, knowing that for some, eating disorders can be chronic. For others, they can just, again, remain something that folks have to continue to contend with.
Yeah, and just in case people don't have enough shame contributing to even the genesis of this problem, right? Let's go ahead and shit on the way that they recover. And I love that you tied it with addiction. That's a great point, because there's been lots of research and experience, and even nowadays, as everyone knows, I lean into the harm reduction approach, which is a more nuanced approach, and also encompasses the idea that the person who is in recovery, that they get to have a say in the definition of what their goals are, and also an appreciation of where they're at versus where they were and one of the things that's the hardest for people to understand about this is it's not about manipulating or pressuring a person into the treatment program or the therapist definition. And that means you have to release control as someone doing treatment and say, you get to determine your goals. And certainly we can comment on if they are not working or hurting you. But if it's like, but what is the definition? And sometimes our definition is you got to be doing the thing. And man, it's not like there's not enough sort of societal dictation about what your body, what you should do with your body. And then we're just going to bring that into a vulnerable population.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you brought up so many good points. And I think what you said about harm reduction is really important, because we do tend to see that more in the field of addiction. But what's been really encouraging is that I have seen harm reduction come up in some eating disorder conferences, and there's more conversation about that, particularly I would say over the past year or two, than I had seen previously. And so I think there's a growing awareness that this push for full recovery for everyone is not necessarily the best approach. And also, I think there's recognition of the fact that the field still today has not come to a general consensus definition of what full recovery even means. So in some ways, I think that's challenging, because it's hard to compare data across studies when we're looking at research. But I also think that it could be limiting potentially if we had one sort of consensus definition, because I do think that there's beauty in allowing and empowering people to come up with their own definition of what recovery means and looks like for them.
It's a great point, because I see, and I live and practice in a state where the state regulations are, if you're going to have a program for addiction, say, that has state funding, you have to teach complete abstinence from any psychoactive substance, except for coffee and cigarettes. Anyway, that old definition of recovery of that's how you can tell, that you're better, and they won't fund that, and they'll actually, you can get in trouble if you work for a nonprofit state-funded agency. You have to push. It's all very, very abstinence 12-step model, and nothing against anybody who has success with that. I've had many guests on the program who've had success with that, but one definition, it's really a good point. It can be very limiting. And the idea, and this kind of leads into something I wanted you to tell us about, the idea of pushing back against control, outside external controlling forces. Isn't that part of it? There's a taking control for one's self that can lead to eating disordered kind of behavior?
Yes, for sure. I think a lot of times people do end up developing an eating disorder partly because they're looking for some semblance of control. Sometimes that can end up seeming cliche to some folks, because I certainly interviewed people for the book who said this had nothing to do with control for me. So it's not one size fits all, of course, in terms of thinking about a diagnosis. But for me, control certainly played into my own eating disorder. I really, after my mom passed away when I was 11, felt like I lost all control. And I also felt like I couldn't do anything to control what happened to my mom's body, but I realized I could control what happened to my own and what I put into my own body. And I think that a lot of times with eating disorders, we think they're going to give us one thing, and in fact, they completely strip us of it. So I thought my eating disorder would give me some semblance of control after my mom died, but in fact, it left me feeling more out of control than ever.
So it's more of a solution, or an attempt at a solution, that then leads to its own problem.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Exactly.
One of the things I noticed, and you're very, very open, very vulnerable about the experiences of your mom and her with cancer and, remission, and then coming back, and different attitudes that she, your father, you all went through. One of the things that stood out to me was that the role of food in your life didn't become pertinent after she died. That you mentioned a lot about the role that food played in your life and in your relationship with her, and so I looked at it more as an evolution of a relationship. There we go, with food and the role that it played in your life.
Yes. And so a lot of people ask me whether or not my mom dieted or if she had issues with food, because sometimes there's a presumption that somehow the mother was to blame. And I always say that my mom and I loved going to Burger King and eating Whoppers together and eating mocha chip ice cream together. And I have so many fun memories of food and my mom. And she really instilled this love for food in me. And we would often just have these fun outings that revolved around going to restaurants. But when she was sick, she really lost her appetite to the point where she became quite frail and looked like a ghost of her former self. And looking back at my mom's old medical records, which I obtained when I wrote this book, I saw that the doctors had diagnosed her as positive for anorexia, which just essentially meant that she was not eating because of other sort of physical symptoms happening to her body. So it was different from anorexia nervosa, which is sort of nervous loss of appetite, and which is what I ended up struggling with. But I was very struck by those similarities. And I remember thinking that the eating disorder was somehow this warped way of feeling closer to her, because just as my mom was frail and in bed in the hospital, I then, just a year and a half later, was also frail and in bed in the hospital. And I thought somehow that that dynamic would make me closer to her. And for a time it did, right? Because so many of my most accessible memories of my mother were of her sick and in bed. And I, in some ways, craved the attention that I got when I was sick. But ultimately, the eating disorder took away so much from me and really did leave me feeling farther away from my mother. And a big part of my recovery was coming to terms with that, and also finally learning to really grieve the loss of my mother.
Yeah, so it could be kind of a stopgap sort of thing. So to as many things that become compulsive are to escape from dealing with that, it sounds like. Yeah. And then that became part of it with your recovery as well. You know, and you can update me, because you obviously are embracing these things more recently. I have always been to understand that, number one, that this is an issue we mostly see in like developed nations, first world nations, that we have the, I guess, time and marketing potential or whatever it is to sit around and think about body types in a way. And also that this disproportionately always has affected women more than men. Although in recent years, my understanding is we're closing that gap as well. Not in making less of a problem, making more of a problem for young boys. So anyway, I'm curious about that's sort of the approach that a lot of us who have been working in therapy for a long time take. Do you find that that's still the indication, those elements?
Yeah, so I think that for a long time, we just collectively as a society were under the impression that eating disorders only affected skinny, white, affluent girls, to the point where there was an acronym for that, SWAG, skinny, white, affluent girls. And certainly more women than men do struggle with eating disorders, but we know that men and boys certainly struggle. They make up about a quarter of people who struggle, a little bit more than that. And they also often get overlooked. And I would say that the same is true of people of color. And part of it has to do with the fact that research shows medical doctors receive 0 to 2 hours of training on eating disorders. And that's really unfortunate when you consider the fact that
the top of that's not good either, right? If the top is average is 2 hours, that's not much better. That's not a lot better than 0.
It's really not. And I was flabbergasted when I came across this research, and I interviewed many doctors who confirmed this and said, yes, I never received any training. And that's wild when you think about the fact that 30 million Americans will struggle with an eating disorder at some point in their lifetime. But because there is this severe lack of medical training, what often happens is that doctors naturally fall back on some of these misconceptions about who does and doesn't struggle with eating disorders. And as a result, anyone who doesn't fit that swag stereotype often can get overlooked. And I interviewed many people, including men and people of color, who said that their doctors just didn't think that they had an eating disorder because they didn't necessarily look the part. Now, that's not what the doctor said verbatim, but that was the underlying message that came across. And there is research showing that people of color and transgendered individuals don't end up getting as much treatment as their white counterparts and their female counterparts. And so I think that there are some systemic issues at play there. And it's one of the reasons why with this book, I didn't just want it to revolve around me and my own story, because in many ways I do fit the stereotypical mold of someone with an eating disorder, in that I'm white, I'm female, I'm middle to upper class, I live in a smaller body. And I wanted to have other people feel seen and heard in this book. And so I include folks who have, who live in larger bodies in the book, people who are of all different genders and races and ethnicities and ages. And so for me to bring those perspectives into the book was really helpful. And it was really eye-opening for me to talk with these individuals and to hear about their own experiences, and also some of the discrimination that they unfortunately faced just as they were trying to seek help. And I say all of this knowing that I think by and large, doctors are very well intentioned. And I think that they want to learn more about eating disorders. I often just hear that anecdotally. But I think that when we think about the training that they get, there is a real lack of understanding around eating disorders. And I hope that that will change over time.
I'm curious about what you see in your experience in talking to people about some of those societal introduction of some of the problematic thinking, some of the societal reinforcement, maybe even praise in some cases, depending on what's going on. You tell the story of receiving a 17 magazine when you were young, and the impact that had. And so I'm curious about, some of your thoughts there.
Sure. So yes, when I was 12 years old, my father got me a subscription to 17 magazine because he thought it might hold answers to womanly questions that I might have that he didn't feel comfortable answering as a single dad and as a widowed dad. So I read that magazine, and I remember reading each magazine every month, front to back. And when I was researching the book, I went back and I bought some old copies of 17 magazine on eBay, and I was able to obtain the first copy that I had ever read. And I was struck by the fact that one of the cover stories was titled "Girls Who Exercise Themselves to Death." And it was a story about girls with eating disorders who were obsessively exercising. And in rereading that story, I remembered little parts of it. And it occurred to me that that was probably my first exposure to eating disorders. And in the back of that magazine and so many of the other issues I read, there were advertisements for fat camps, where essentially children as young as 8 years old could go to these camps to lose weight. And these ads were quite prevalent at the time. Just to situate us in the time period, this was 1997.
And so under a certain age don't know maybe that they called them fat camps. That wasn't.
They did.
Yeah.
Yes, right. I mean, it's funny when I talk to my college students now, I'm a professor, but they'll often say 17 magazine, what is that? Or fat camps, what are those? So I have to sort of think about my audience here. But yes, for me at the time, I was quite intrigued by this idea of a fat camp. And so I think that there's so many messages still today around this idea of the thin ideal, and our culture is still so firmly rooted in weight stigma and fat phobia. And a lot of the people I interviewed for the book would talk about how they would get complimented when they lost weight, even though they were doing so in a very harmful way, right? They were engaging in disordered behaviors and falling deeper into their eating disorder. But because they were not emaciated or clinically underweight, they were not seen as having an eating disorder. And in fact, were praised by family, sometimes by clinicians for the weight loss. And so I think it can be really hard to recover into our society knowing that there is so much weight stigma, and that can make it, I think, really hard to figure out what recovery really looks like in a world where we are so often confronted with these images of the thin ideal.
And as you touched on too, yeah, we have so much thought about the shape of someone's body, and yet there's a societal expectation, and you see people even on social media get angry when this is challenged, that everybody has the right to impose judgment on everybody else's body and appearance. And you see with the body positivity movement, people who push back by saying like, no, I should be able to, it's my duty to tell people, get it together based off your photo on your social media. And I don't even know you. I know that I've heard many times where parents will be concerned for first they'll say, I'm concerned for the health of my kid. And you have to break that down, even for the individual. This is not picking on anyone, to say, what are my expectations and biases that I am projecting onto my child, to say, am I really worried about their health, or am I more worried about how they look, and are they putting on a few pounds? Then they get into, and I've heard people literally verbalize this question, how can I avoid criticizing my child's weight while still telling them that they need to lose weight? And it's like, okay, let's think about what you just said. It's essentially, how can I criticize my child's weight without them knowing that I'm criticizing their weight and having the negative effects that I know that will have psychologically? It's a tough place where people get into, legitimately tough, but also how much of that is our biases, right? Of what we think someone should look like.
Yes, exactly. And I think that so often conversations around what children should and shouldn't eat tend to be quite subjective. And we see teachers influencing children's thoughts around that, parents influencing thoughts around it. We know parents can't categorically cause eating disorders, but certainly we as parents have influence over our children and the ways in which they perceive their bodies. And so I'm of the mindset that we shouldn't be talking with children about weight loss. We can certainly be teaching them about what it means to eat a variety of different foods and this idea that food can be fuel. But I don't think that children should ever have to be preoccupied with this idea of losing weight, because for children that can be very confusing. It's hard to know what that actually looks like. And I've talked with doctors who have said that sometimes they've worked with eating disorder patients who were told that they needed to lose weight, and then there was never any follow-up, and they kept losing weight. They were in an energy deficit, which just propelled them into an eating disorder. So I think we have to be really careful with the language that we use, and also extend ourselves grace, because we're never going to be perfect. And there are going to be times when maybe we say something about our child's body and we regret it, right? And so I think one of the things I've learned as a parent is to just acknowledge when maybe we've slipped up, or maybe we've said something that didn't come across in quite the right way, and to be able to ask for forgiveness in those moments and see those as moments of growth, because so much of parenting is figuring it out as we go.
And it's not like they're not already getting the messages, as you put it, age 12, 17 magazine, kids at school, mean kid behavior, judgmental. And yeah, I had heard this, that just like you said, avoiding talking about weight at all and looking at things like, hey, if we have better cardiovascular health, you can run more. You're going to enjoy your dance class, your karate class more if you're doing it. And boy, you're doing your exercises. Well, good for you. You're going to be strong, and, and being flexible. I need to do that too. And isn't it fun when we can do something where we move our bodies around, and that's very, very tricky. Once again, going back to the harm reduction mindset. It's not to trick someone into losing weight. If that's our goal, we're going to mess up more than if our goal is to say, well, I really do, despite the shape of any of our bodies, do I want to be a buff, good looking 90-year-old, or do I want to be able to get up and down out of a chair? right? What is more important, kind of thing,
Yes.
is the effects of health versus the fear of sickness, I guess would be a way to put that.
Hmm.
You
Yeah.
mentioned that a lot of professionals in the treatment community have I wrote down a note here that you talk about avoiding talking about calories in treatment, not just, and that's very interesting to me because I've known so many people that have gone through treatment where it was like reinforcing the idea of math. You're getting your calories in, calories out. You can't walk up the stairs this many times per day because it burns this many calories in the treatment facility, right? Things like that. But it seems like there's an emphasis away from that, maybe.
There is. When I was in treatment, again in the late 1990s, there was so much talk about calories, and I was quite obsessive about counting calories. I look back in my old journals from that time, and they're quite frankly heartbreaking to look at because they're just filled with all these different numbers where I was adding up calories. And there was a lot of discussion about it at the time, but the field has really tried to move away from that because there's more of an emphasis on what different types of food are you eating? What types of food do you want, but maybe your disorder is telling you shouldn't have? What types of grains might we need? What types of vegetables or fruits do we want? And so it's more talking about the actual types of foods as opposed to focusing on numbers. Now, certainly the dietitians, for instance, in treatment centers are still counting the calories themselves to make sure that patients are getting what they need, but they're not talking about calories with patients because so often eating disorder patients are like walking calculators where they're always thinking about calories in, calories out. And so to have providers who are reinforcing that is not necessarily a great thing. And so in more recent years, clinicians have really tried to take a step back from that and really focus more on, here's how many grains you need, here's how many proteins, talking about it in slightly more neutral terms.
I really liked when you talked about the assessment of, as you just mentioned, different kinds of foods, even coming in. Fear foods, safe foods, were some of the terms that I saw.
Yes. Yeah. I had a very long list of fear foods when I was in treatment. And the nice thing is when I was talking with lots of treatment providers when writing the book, many of them said that they try to work with clients. So if the client, for instance, has a really long list of fear foods, they're not going to tell the client, okay, you've got to start off on day one just tackling this list of fear foods. They're going to say, okay, what are some foods that feel safe? Let's work on eating those and then building in some of these quote unquote fear foods. And maybe for someone, a fear food is a cookie. Maybe it is nuts, which may seem too quote unquote fatty, right? Whatever it might be, a lot of times people with eating disorders develop these rules around what they can and can't eat. And so part of treatment is learning how to break those rules in service of recovery.
I was also fascinated by, you mentioned some research about whether or not someone develops the ability to select higher or lower fat foods and the relationship that has with relapse. I thought that was very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's actually a lot of research out now that shows that when kind of children especially, but even adults are sort of having these higher fat foods. And when they are getting up to more of kind of their kind of goal weight, they are more likely to sustain their recovery. So years ago when I was in treatment, the goal was to get me to sort of just the bare minimum of where I needed to be weight wise. And then I would always get discharged, but I always felt like I was in this very precarious, vulnerable situation because my body still wasn't quite where it needed to be weight wise. Now in treatment centers, there's a push to get people to really try to be where their body needs to be. And so providers will look at previous weight charts and say, okay, if this child, for instance, was in the 60th percentile for the majority of their life before their eating disorder, we need to get them back up to that 60th percentile in order for them to be more likely to maintain their recovery and to not fall into a relapse.
Wow. Yeah, a whole new way of thinking. And once again, judgment and shame often enters in when people are like, here's what you should do to recover. And it's the same thing as over focus on weight or just counting calories. it's not only not helpful and shaming and ethically and psychologically damaging, it's not as effective either. That's the other thing. It's when we're doing it wrong, it's wrong, not just for some kind of like touchy-feely reasons, but reasons of it doesn't work as well, which I think is interesting. You talk a lot about the importance of different kind of narratives or narrations that we have in our heads and how we kind of get a shorthand for our story. And I'm curious about that role of those thoughts and narrations that we get into.
Yes. So as a writer, I think a lot about narrative and just the power of storytelling. I always think about how writing is not therapy, but it can be therapeutic. And for a long time, as I mentioned, I really tried to kind of just project this idea of being someone whose narrative followed this path of full recovery, right? I had sort of crossed the finish line into full recovery and really sort of believed that that was what I needed to convey in terms of sharing my own story. And I think it makes sense that I fell into that trap, if you will, because societally, we prefer protagonists who prevail and who triumph over their disorders. And those are the types of stories we like to hear. And yet, they're not always all that relatable, right? I mean, certainly it's great when there are people who prevail. And in the book, I include a lot of perspectives from people who consider themselves to be fully recovered. And I think it's important to elevate those voices. But I think we also need to be really truthful about all the other narratives that exist. And for me, it's been really important to frame my thinking around what I call restorative narratives. So I worked for a nonprofit organization. At the time, it was called Images and Voices of Hope. But one of my tasks was to help journalists to tell more restorative narratives. And this was a name that we gave to a genre of stories that looked at how people and communities were moving forward in the aftermath of illness or tragedy or trauma. Because so often in journalism, we tell the story of the problem or the tragedy or the illness, but then we don't tell the story of what happened after the fact. And maybe we tell an anniversary story, or maybe we sort of talk about someone's illness, and then in the next paragraph, we jump to the fact that they're now recovered. But so often we're missing these middles, right? And it's partly because these middles can get messy. They're hard to talk about. They can be hard to write about. But as a journalist working for this nonprofit, I really wanted to help other journalists to explore this messy middle. And as I was working with journalists, it occurred to me that this framework could be really helpful for my own narrative and my own experiences with an eating disorder. So I began to then develop this thinking around what I call the middle place, right? What does it mean to live in this space between acute sickness and full recovery? And so framing my narrative around this idea of a restorative narrative, I think has allowed for a lot more honesty and a lot more thought and nuance around what recovery actually looks like.
And as I always think, it's very valuable when we see a gap, there's something that's missing, to either find it or fill it a lot of times. And you're actually doing a lot to fill the gap, which is like you're writing a book about, hey, no one's talking about this. And I could just imagine how powerful that is for people to feel seen when it's like, oh, I don't look like that movie account of what I saw, or that story of here's where I am now and where I am now. And as you put it, I think sometimes there is an omission of those when people say, "Oh, so and so's fully recovered" or whatever. There's things that we kind of leave out that are like, even in my definition of fully recovered, I might still have a lot of struggles, and not telling that story does a disservice, I think, many times. So
I think so too. Yeah.
Well, I want people to know where they can follow you and follow your work. And before we say that, my recurring question that I have for my guests is we love to highlight nonprofits and charitable organizations on the program. Do you have any organizations that are near and dear to your heart or ways of giving back to the community that you could share with listeners?
Sure. So there are a lot of great organizations dedicated to helping people with eating disorders. And I would recommend the National Alliance for Eating Disorders. So they're a wonderful organization that really tries to raise awareness around eating disorders. They do a lot of work around eating disorder prevention, which is something I believe strongly in. And they also have a lot of virtual support groups as well. So they're an organization I would definitely check out, especially if there are any listeners who are wanting to seek additional support for their eating disorder.
That's wonderful. And I love that, the online kind of dissemination of information, or people being able to join together is such a great thing people can use now. Where can people best follow you? And is there a place in particular that you'd recommend for them to procure the book?
Yes, thank you for asking. So I have a weekly Substack newsletter where I share a lot of writing tips and best practices. So that's Mallary, Mallary.substack.com. And I will be posting news and information about my book tour on there. So if any listeners are in a book tour city, would love to see you. And I also am on Instagram where I'm pretty active. It's just my full name, Mallary Tenor Tarpley. And the best way to order the book is wherever you buy books online, or come August 5th, you'll be able to get it in bookstores, but it's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, independent bookstores. So I hope that listeners will check it out. And even though it's primarily focused on eating disorders, it also touches upon a lot of other themes like loss and grief and motherhood and recovery from any mental health disorder, really. So I feel like there's hopefully a lot of different points of relatability for folks.
It's a great point because, it is important. I think we're finding more and more the concept of recovery as a scale, and also not just as a scale to where we can judge where someone is, but that there's an individualization of what equals success and goals that are healthy. Well, as everybody knows, we also pick a monthly charity that we highlight, generally a local charity to a local area. And this month, we're focused on Covenant House California, which you can learn about at covenanthousecalifornia.org. I did not know this till I picked this charity, but 1/3 of the homeless adolescent population in the U.S. are in California. And this organization believes that every youth deserves a home, and they particularly provide housing and other kinds and find housing and other situations and solutions for homeless youth who are, disproportionately, even amongst the homeless population, at risk for assault, abuse, robbery, addiction is also a big part of that. This is also something that disproportionately affects the queer population as well. And so there's a lot of good work that they do. They're very, very highly rated in charity ratings. And so go to covenanthousecalifornia.org. As always, if you decide to support The Broken Brain at patreon.com/brokenbrain, 50% of your donation will go to the charity of highlight for this month, and will continue to go to Covenant House California for as long as you remain a member of our Patreon, as well as the fun bonus materials that you will get, and helping us to continue our mission here of psychoeducation and sharing important messages. Speaking of important messages, people should read this book. They should read this book, Slip, by Mallary Tenor Tarpley. And Mallary, thank you for being here. Thank you for writing this, by the way.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Court and Parts Podcast Network. To listen to more Court and Parts shows, visit courtandarts.com.
Hello. I am so glad you're here. Welcome to the To Mom is to Love podcast. My name is Valerie Probstfeld. I am a nurse practitioner as well as an imperfect mom who loves. In fact, I thought I would be an A-plus mother before becoming a mom. However, as the years passed, I realized love is the only thing I can control. In fact, the verb to mother means to love. Merriam-Webster defines to mom as to give birth or rise, as well as to care for or protect. And just think about it. Love gives birth, allows ourselves and families to rise, and enables us to care for and protect. We have more power as moms than we realize. In 5 generations from now, you will have approximately 30 descendants, and the number keeps getting larger and larger. Motherhood is the most important job in the world. Our mission is to support, encourage, and empower each other as imperfect moms to love as a verb. Come join us as we navigate our shared name, live our verb, and rediscover our identity. Please subscribe, share, and follow. And I would love it if you leave a review so more moms can come join us. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, as well as TikTok and YouTube. Please follow along with us on this beautiful journey we call motherhood.